He does not wash the bike, he polishes it. There is a difference, and he will explain it to anyone who stands still long enough. The rag moves in circles over chrome that was already spotless. The garage smells like petroleum and old rubber, and something that does not have a name but feels, somehow, like 1971. Nobody asked him to be here on a Saturday morning. Nobody needed this machine to run. It already runs. It ran yesterday. It will run tomorrow. But here he is anyway, alone under a single bulb, attending to something that the rest of the world stopped caring about decades ago. This is not maintenance. This is something else entirely. To understand what is really happening in that garage, you have to go back to a specific moment in American and Western cultural history, the post-war years, when the factory floor was the center of masculine identity. Fathers in the 1950s did not talk about feelings. They talked about torque. They talked about compression ratios and timing belts. A man who could fix an engine was a man who had mastered something real, something that pushed back, something that either worked or it did not. There was no ambiguity in a carburetor. There was no politics in a crankshaft. The machine was honest in a way that people, increasingly, were not. Boys who grew up in households shaped by that culture absorbed something specific. Competence was love. The ability to build or repair a physical object was the closest many fathers came to saying, "You matter." When a man handed his teenage son a wrench and said, "Figure it out," he was not being cold, he was passing something down. A language without words. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, motorcycles had taken on an additional layer of meaning. They were no longer just machines, they were a posture. After the release of Easy Rider in 1969, riding became tangled with the idea of freedom from a country that many young people felt had betrayed them. Vietnam, assassinations, a government that seemed to speak in a dialect that had nothing to do with their actual lives. The motorcycle was the vehicle of refusal. You could not draft a man on a motorcycle into an ideology. He was already moving. But here's what gets missed in that romantic reading. Most of the men who fell in love with vintage bikes in that era were not radicals. They were ordinary, working-class and middle-class teenagers who simply wanted to feel something that belonged entirely to them. The bike was the only object in their world that they could understand completely, modify freely, and claim as their own expression. In a decade defined by institutional failure, the motorcycle was personal sovereignty measured in cubic centimeters. Then something happened in the 1980s that changed everything, and it changed it quietly. Manufacturing moved. The factories that had defined entire towns and given blue-collar men a clear sense of purpose began to close or hollow out. What replaced them were service jobs, cubicle jobs, jobs where nothing you made with your hands lasted past the end of the business day. The shift was economic, but it landed psychologically. A man who once could point to something he had built, a weld, an assembly, a machine that ran because of his specific skill, now processed invoices. He answered phones. His contribution was invisible the moment it was made. The vintage motorcycle did not leave with the factories. It stayed. And this is where the psychology becomes genuinely interesting. Research on what psychologists call object attachment suggests that human beings form deep emotional bonds with physical items that carry what is called biographical resonance. Objects that hold memories, mark transitions, and represent versions of the self that might otherwise disappear. The vintage motorcycle, for the men who came of age in the 1960s and 70s, is not a hobby. It is a preserved artifact of the self. It is the version of them that knew how to fix things, the version that was young, the version that felt, however briefly, entirely free. Polishing chrome is not vanity, it is preservation, not of the machine, of the man. There is another layer that rarely gets examined. Vintage motorcycle culture has an extraordinarily specific relationship with mechanical knowledge that is no longer common. A 1968 Triumph Bonneville, a 1972 Honda CB350, a 1965 BSA Lightning. These machines were built before computer diagnostics, before fuel injection, before sealed units that require a dealership to open. A person who can restore and maintain one of these bikes possesses a form of knowledge that is genuinely rare now. It cannot be Googled in any useful way. It must be learned through hands-on experience, passed between people, earned through mistakes that are expensive and satisfying in roughly equal measure. This creates something psychologists refer to as epistemic identity, a sense of self rooted in specialized knowing. When someone has spent 40 years understanding a category of machine that most of the world has moved past, they have built an identity around being one of the few people left who truly understand something. This is not arrogance. It is a response to a world that has consistently devalued the kind of knowing they possess. If formal credentials do not recognize what they know, and if the economy no longer needs what they can do, the vintage bike community becomes the one place where their knowledge is currency. Watch how a vintage rider interacts with other vintage riders. The conversation drops immediately to specifics: which carburetor jets were original on a particular year model, which frame modifications compromised handling, which oil formulations work best in engines designed before modern additives existed. This is not small talk. This is a form of mutual authentication. They are confirming to each other that the knowledge is real, that it matters, that they are not obsolete. What most outsiders interpret as stubbornness, the refusal to ride anything modern, the dismissal of fuel-injected bikes, the almost aggressive loyalty to old technology, is better understood as boundary maintenance. The modern motorcycle is faster, safer, more reliable, and easier to own. Everyone knows this, including the vintage rider. But accepting a modern bike means accepting that the skills accumulated over decades are no longer necessary. It means conceding that the world they mastered has been replaced by a world that does not need them to master anything. The old bike is not just a preference, it is a protected domain. This is also why the restoration process matters as much as the riding. Many vintage motorcycle owners spend more hours working on the bike than riding it. To outside observers, this looks irrational. If the goal is transportation or even pleasure, a running bike would accomplish that more efficiently than a half-disassembled engine spread across a workbench. But the goal is not transportation. The goal is the process itself, the problem-solving, the diagnosis, the moment when something that was broken becomes, through skill and patience and accumulated knowledge, something that works again. That moment is not about the machine. There is also something specific happening around the sensory experience of a vintage bike that modern engineering has deliberately engineered away. Old motorcycles are loud, physically demanding, and temperamental. They vibrate in ways that modern rubber-mounted engines do not. They require active management, reading the throttle, listening for changes in the exhaust note, feeling through the handlebars for early signs of mechanical stress. Riding one is an act of sustained attention. It is the opposite of the passive, screen-mediated experience that defines much of contemporary life. Neuroscience research on flow states suggests that activities requiring high skill, immediate feedback, and full physical engagement are among the most effective generators of what is described as present-moment absorption. The vintage motorcycle rider on a long, empty road is not thinking about retirement or declining health or a country that has moved on without consulting him. He is listening to the engine. He's feeling the road through 40-year-old suspension geometry. He is entirely, completely here. The world calls this nostalgia and moves on. But nostalgia is too small a word for what is actually happening. Nostalgia is passive. It is looking at photographs. What the vintage motorcycle rider is engaged in is something closer to active resistance, the deliberate maintenance of a relationship between a human being and physical reality, between skill and outcome, between effort and meaning, in an era that has made all of those connections increasingly optional. He is not stuck in the past. He just never agreed that the past was something you were supposed to leave behind.